The train slowed with a long metallic screech before finally coming to a stop beneath the blazing summer sun. Behind rows of barbed wire, hundreds of German prisoners leaned against the wooden slats of crowded boxcars, exhausted after weeks of uncertainty. Many had spent months believing stories repeated endlessly by Nazi propaganda, that if they were ever captured by the Americans, humiliation, starvation, or even execution would be waiting on the other side of the fence. The doors swung open. The prisoners hesitated. Armed American guards stood outside, but something felt wrong. No one was shouting. No rifle butts forced them forward. Instead, they heard a calm voice directing them into orderly lines. Nearby, another soldier pointed toward large canvas tents where steaming food was already being prepared. The smell drifted through the warm air, mixing with fresh bread and coffee. For a brief moment, the prisoners wondered if this was some kind of trick. It was easier to believe a deception than to accept what they were seeing. Because only months earlier, many of these same men had fought fiercely across France, Italy, and North Africa. They had watched cities burn, friends disappear under artillery fire, and entire divisions collapse beneath overwhelming Allied strength. Now they stood on American soil expecting the worst. What they found instead would become one of the least expected chapters of the Second World War. Not because war had suddenly become merciful, but because the battle had entered an entirely different arena. Most people imagine prisoner of war camps as places of constant misery. Endless hunger, brutality, and hopelessness behind barbed wire. Decades of films and photographs have reinforced that image. In war, captivity is often seen as another battlefield where suffering simply takes a different form. For German prisoners arriving in the United States, that assumption seemed certain. After all, millions of soldiers had already witnessed unimaginable cruelty across Europe and Asia. Entire populations struggled to survive. Food was rationed. Cities lay in ruins. Every nation demanded sacrifice from its people. So why would an enemy nation spend valuable food, medicine, labor, and resources caring for the very soldiers who had fought against them? The answer was far more complicated than simple kindness. It involved international law, military strategy, economics, propaganda, and a quiet confidence that victory could be demonstrated as much through humanity as through firepower. The prisoners couldn't see that on the day they arrived. All they noticed were the details. A clean uniform issued after a hot shower, fresh blankets, medical examinations, letters that could eventually be sent home, meals served at regular times. And then came something so ordinary to Americans that it barely deserved attention. A cold bottle of Coca-Cola. Later, for many prisoners, another unforgettable surprise followed. Ice cream. For men who had survived years of shortages, relentless fighting, and collapsing supply lines, these simple comforts felt almost unreal. Some would later write that they questioned whether they were dreaming. Others wondered whether the Americans were preparing them for interrogation with unexpected generosity. The truth was both simpler and far more fascinating. Behind every bottle, every meal, and every carefully organized camp stood an enormous system powered by American industry on a scale few Germans had ever imagined. Farms harvested food by the millions of tons. Railroads stretched across a continent. Factories that built bombers one week could package consumer goods the next. The same logistical machine that supplied armies across two oceans also sustained hundreds of thousands of enemy prisoners. Within days, many German soldiers would begin questioning everything they had been taught about America. Within weeks, friendships would emerge between former enemies separated only by a fence. Within months, thousands of prisoners would be working on American farms, helping harvest crops desperately needed during wartime labor shortages. And years after the guns finally fell silent, some of those same men would make a decision almost impossible to imagine while the war still raged. They would return, not as prisoners but as immigrants. Yet none of that was visible on the first day. Standing in line beneath the American sun, tired, hungry, and deeply suspicious, the prisoners still believed there had to be a catch. Because wars are fought with bullets. But sometimes they are won by something far more unexpected. And before a single scoop of ice cream or the first sip of Coca-Cola ever crossed those prisoners' hands, a quiet decision made thousands of miles away had already begun changing how an entire generation of German soldiers would remember the United States forever. The first days inside the American camps did not erase fear. German prisoners still counted the fences, watched the guards, and whispered among themselves at night. Many had crossed the Atlantic expecting punishment. Instead, they found order. Rows of barracks stretched across dusty fields. Mess halls smelled of bread, coffee, and stew. Medical staff checked wounds and illnesses. Showers, clean clothing, and blankets were issued with military efficiency. None of it felt luxurious by American standards, but to men who had endured collapsing supply lines, retreat, and hunger, it felt almost impossible. At Camp Hearn in Texas, Camp Shelby in Mississippi, and dozens of other POW camps scattered across the United States, the same pattern repeated. Prisoners arrived suspicious and exhausted. Then they discovered that meals came at regular hours. They discovered that letters could be written home. They discovered that guards often spoke to them calmly instead of shouting orders through rifle barrels. For some prisoners, the shock was not a single dramatic moment. It was a slow accumulation of details. A hot meal after transport, a doctor treating an infection, a baseball game in a dusty field, a cold drink handed across a counter. One former prisoner later remembered staring at a bottle of Coca-Cola as if it were a symbol from another world. In wartime Germany, shortages had become normal. Sugar was scarce. Consumer goods disappeared. Civilians and soldiers alike had learned to ration, improvise, and go without. But in the United States, even during war, factories still produced familiar comforts on a massive scale. The prisoners began to notice the abundance around them. American trains moved constantly. Trucks delivered food and supplies. Farms stretched beyond the camp fences. Store shelves in nearby towns still carried products Germans had not seen in years. To the prisoners, this abundance was not just surprising. It was strategic evidence. It showed the scale of American industrial power more clearly than any speech or propaganda broadcast. The camps themselves were part of that system. By the middle of the war, the United States held hundreds of thousands of German POWs. Housing, feeding, guarding, and transporting so many prisoners required organization on a continental scale. Yet American officials believed that following the Geneva Convention was not only a legal obligation. It was also a practical and moral statement. The prisoners were enemies, but they were still prisoners of war, not targets for revenge. That distinction mattered. In Europe, reports of brutal treatment in some camps had circulated widely. German propaganda had warned soldiers that surrendering to the Americans would bring humiliation or worse. So when prisoners discovered that camp rules were enforced with discipline but not constant cruelty, many struggled to reconcile that reality with what they had been taught. A guard offering directions. A medic treating a fever. A camp kitchen serving enough food to quiet hunger. These scenes did not fit the expectations carried across the ocean. The food became one of the clearest symbols of the difference. POW meals were not feasts, but they were generally adequate and regular. Bread, potatoes, meat, vegetables, coffee, and occasional treats appeared with a consistency that surprised many prisoners. In some camps, prisoners could purchase small items at camp canteens using wages earned through approved work programs. That was where Coca-Cola sometimes entered the story. For Americans, Coca-Cola was ordinary. For German POWs, it represented refrigeration, sugar, distribution networks, and consumer culture operating even during wartime. The same was true of ice cream. A frozen dessert might sound trivial beside the destruction of war, but for prisoners who had known years of deprivation, it became unforgettable. One prisoner reportedly joked that he had expected to be starved, not served dessert. The deeper shock was not simply kindness. It was contradiction. The prisoners had been taught to see America as weak, decadent, and morally inferior. Yet the camps revealed a nation capable of defeating Germany militarily while still maintaining systems of law, supply, and civilian comfort. That did not mean the camps were perfect. There were tensions, strict rules, ideological conflicts among prisoners, and moments of hardship. But compared with the expectations many prisoners carried, the reality was startling. Outside the camps, another pressure was shaping policy. Labor shortages. Millions of American men were serving overseas, leaving farms and industries short of workers. Under Geneva Convention rules, POWs could be assigned to certain kinds of labor, especially agricultural work. So German prisoners began leaving the camps in guarded work details. They harvested cotton in Texas. They picked vegetables in California. They worked in canneries, lumber operations, and farms across the country. For many Americans, this was the first close contact with German soldiers outside the battlefield. Farmers who needed labor sometimes found the prisoners disciplined and useful. Prisoners, in turn, encountered ordinary American civilians. Farm families, shopkeepers, children, and workers whose lives looked very different from the image painted by wartime propaganda. Conversations began cautiously. A farmer might offer extra water on a hot day. A prisoner might ask about crops, weather, or family. Small exchanges slowly complicated the simple enemy image both sides had carried. Not every interaction was warm. Some Americans had lost relatives in the war. Some prisoners remained loyal to Nazi ideology and caused problems inside the camps. The camps were still prisons, surrounded by fences and guards. But the daily reality was more human, more ordinary, and more complicated than many prisoners had expected. And that complexity was the beginning of a much larger transformation. Because the cold Coca-Cola, the scoop of ice cream, the regular meals, and the orderly camps were only the first signs of something the prisoners had not anticipated. Captivity in America would force many of them to confront a different vision of the enemy they thought they understood. As the months passed, the rhythm of camp life became strangely predictable. Morning roll calls echoed across the compounds. Work details assembled before sunrise. Trucks carried groups of prisoners through quiet American towns toward farms, forests, and factories that desperately needed labor. Every day followed military discipline, yet every day also chipped away at assumptions that many prisoners had carried since the war began. For American officials, these work programs solved a growing problem. Millions of young American men were fighting in Europe and the Pacific. Fields still needed to be harvested. Timber still had to be cut. Food still had to reach cities and military bases. Rather than allowing thousands of able-bodied prisoners to remain idle behind barbed wire, the government assigned many of them to agricultural and other non-combat labor, in accordance with the Geneva Convention. For the prisoners, stepping outside the camp fences was like entering another world. The countryside stretched endlessly beneath wide blue skies. Small towns bustled with activity. Freight trains thundered across the landscape carrying tanks, grain, automobiles, fuel, and countless other supplies. Everywhere they looked, America seemed to be building, growing, and producing. One German mechanic who had spent years repairing military vehicles later admitted that what impressed him most was not a weapon. It was the traffic. Road after road filled with trucks, endless freight cars, busy repair shops, petrol stations stocked with fuel. The scale of movement was unlike anything he had witnessed back home during the final years of the war. Germany's factories had become targets of relentless Allied bombing. Rail lines were repeatedly damaged. Fuel shortages crippled transportation. Every journey required careful planning. In America, the roads never seemed to stop moving. That realization quietly changed how many prisoners viewed the conflict. The Allies had not won simply because they possessed better weapons in every battle. They had built an industrial system capable of replacing losses faster than their enemies could inflict them. Every truck delivering food to a prison camp represented the same logistical machine that supplied armies across Europe. The prisoners were witnessing the hidden foundation of victory. Sometimes those lessons came in unexpected ways. On hot summer afternoons, American supervisors occasionally allowed work crews a short break beneath the shade of large trees. Coolers appeared with drinking water. In some locations, especially after particularly demanding work, local employers or military personnel offered soft drinks. For a prisoner who had marched across battlefields with empty canteens, holding an icy bottle of Coca-Cola became more than a pleasant surprise. It became a symbol. The glass felt cold in his hands. The cap hissed as it opened. Tiny bubbles rushed to the surface. The sweet taste contrasted sharply with memories of wartime shortages back home. It was not the drink itself that stayed in many memories. It was what the drink represented. Factories still produced it. Trucks still delivered it. Stores still sold it. Even during a global war, the American economy continued producing comforts alongside bombers, tanks, and ammunition. Another surprise arrived during the hottest months of the year. Ice cream. Some prisoners later recalled laughing in disbelief when frozen desserts appeared. They had expected captivity to mean constant deprivation. Instead, they found themselves eating something many civilians in Europe could only dream about during the war. These moments did not erase homesickness or fear. Many prisoners worried constantly about their families. They had no way of knowing whether their hometowns had survived Allied bombing. Letters often took weeks or months to arrive. Sometimes they never arrived at all. One evening, after returning from farm work, a young prisoner finally received a letter from Germany. The paper was thin. The handwriting belonged to his mother. She described damaged buildings, food shortages, and nights spent in bomb shelters listening to aircraft overhead. She reassured him that she was alive, but several neighbors had disappeared beneath the rubble after recent air raids. He folded the letter carefully. Only hours earlier, he had been eating a generous evening meal in an American camp. Now guilt replaced gratitude. The comforts surrounding him suddenly felt heavier. Many prisoners experienced the same emotional conflict. They were physically safer than they had been on the front lines. They often had enough food. Medical care was available. Yet their families remained trapped inside a collapsing Germany. Captivity became emotionally complicated. Relief mixed with anxiety. Safety mixed with helplessness. Meanwhile, life inside the camps developed its own routines. Prisoners organized soccer matches and volleyball games. Some built small orchestras using handmade instruments. Others attended educational classes where they studied mathematics, languages, engineering, agriculture, or vocational skills. Camp libraries offered books that many had never expected to read during wartime. For American authorities, these activities served several purposes. They maintained order, reduced boredom, and encouraged discipline. For many prisoners, they became a reminder that life could continue even behind barbed wire. But beneath the surface, another struggle unfolded. Not every German prisoner accepted defeat. Within several camps, committed Nazi supporters attempted to maintain ideological control over fellow prisoners. They organized secret meetings, intimidated those who criticized Hitler, and sometimes violently attacked prisoners they considered traitors. American guards soon realized that the greatest threat inside certain camps did not always come from escape attempts. Sometimes it came from the prisoners themselves. To protect vulnerable inmates, authorities transferred hardline Nazis into separate compounds whenever possible. The camps became divided between those who still believed ultimate victory was possible and those who quietly accepted that Germany's future had already changed forever. One former infantryman later recalled the moment his beliefs finally began to crumble. He had been assigned to repair fencing near the edge of a farming community. An elderly American farmer approached carrying 2 baskets of peaches. Without saying much, the farmer handed several pieces of fruit to the prisoners before continuing his work. The German soldier stood frozen. He had spent years believing ordinary Americans hated him personally. Instead, he had encountered a tired old man more interested in finishing the harvest than taking revenge. That simple act stayed with him for decades. It did not erase the war. It did not excuse the suffering experienced on either side. But it challenged everything propaganda had taught him. As 1945 approached, news spread rapidly through the camps. American newspapers reported Allied advances. Maps posted inside compounds showed shrinking German territory. Rumors became daily conversations. Had Berlin fallen? Was Hitler still alive? Would the war end before summer? Then one day confirmation arrived. Germany had surrendered. Silence settled across many barracks. Some prisoners celebrated because the killing had finally ended. Others wept openly. Some simply stared at the ground, realizing that the country they had left behind no longer existed in the form they remembered. Yet the greatest surprise was still waiting beyond the war itself. Because when the gates eventually opened and these men were given the chance to return home, an unexpected number would make a decision almost no one, American or German, could have imagined when they first stepped off those prison trains years earlier. The war had ended, but for many of the men who had lived behind the barbed wire of American prisoner of war camps, the journey was far from over. One by one, the camps that had once held hundreds of thousands of German prisoners not only military strength but also confidence in the rule of law. By largely adhering to international standards for prisoner treatment, it projected an image of a nation that believed its values were strongest when tested during war, not after it. That decision had consequences far beyond the camps themselves. Years later, some former prisoners made an extraordinary choice. They returned to the United States voluntarily. Not as soldiers, not as prisoners, but as immigrants. They built businesses, raised families, and became part of the same country they had once fought against. It was a decision almost unimaginable during the darkest days of World War II. It also revealed something profound about the power of human experience. Propaganda can shape expectations. War can create hatred. But personal encounters have the ability to change minds in ways that speeches and slogans never can. For many German POWs, America was no longer an abstract enemy described by wartime broadcasts. It became a place filled with real people. Farmers, doctors, cooks, guards, mechanics, and families, whose actions often spoke louder than political ideology. Looking back today, it is easy to focus on the dramatic battles of World War II. The beaches of Normandy, the streets of Stalingrad, the skies over Britain, or the forests of the Ardennes. Those battles shaped the outcome of the war. But quieter stories also shaped the peace that followed. Stories inside prison camps. Stories on dusty farms. Stories over shared meals. Stories where former enemies slowly began to see one another as human beings rather than symbols of opposing nations. In the end, the greatest surprise began to empty. Barracks that had echoed with roll calls, conversations, and the sounds of daily routines slowly fell silent. Guards who had watched over former enemies packed their equipment and returned to civilian life. The trains arrived once again, but this time they carried prisoners toward ships waiting to take them back across the Atlantic. Many of the men looked out the windows as America disappeared behind them. They remembered the endless farms stretching to the horizon. The small towns where children waved as work details passed by. The farmers who had shared water during long summer afternoons. The first bottle of Coca-Cola they had tasted after years of war. The unexpected scoop of ice cream that seemed almost unbelievable in the middle of a global conflict. These memories stayed with them. Not because they erased the hardships of captivity, but because they challenged everything they had expected to find. Returning home was not the joyful reunion many had imagined. Germany was a nation transformed by defeat. Entire neighborhoods had vanished beneath bombing raids. Railways lay twisted and broken. Factories that once powered Europe's largest military machine were silent ruins. Millions of families searched desperately for missing fathers, sons, and brothers. Food remained scarce. Housing was limited. The country itself was divided, both physically and politically. Many former prisoners stepped off trains into cities they barely recognized. Some found their homes destroyed. Others learned that parents, wives, or siblings had not survived the war. For these men, captivity in America had ended, but rebuilding a life had only just begun. Yet something remarkable happened in the years that followed. As Germany slowly recovered, former prisoners began sharing stories that often surprised those around them. They spoke about orderly prison camps, about fair treatment under the Geneva Convention, about American guards who enforced discipline without unnecessary cruelty, about farmers who treated them as workers rather than monsters. And yes, they spoke about ordinary things that became unforgettable because of the extraordinary circumstances. A cold bottle of Coca-Cola on a hot afternoon, fresh fruit during harvest season, or ice cream served while the world around them was still at war. To many listeners, these stories sounded almost impossible. They did not fit the popular image of life behind barbed wire. But history is rarely as simple as we expect. The American prison camps were not luxury resorts, nor were they free from hardship, loneliness, or fear. They were still places of confinement. Freedom was gone. Families were far away. Every prisoner carried uncertainty about the future. Yet within those fences, another lesson quietly unfolded. The United States chose to demonstrate was never the Coca-Cola. It was never the ice cream. Those were simply visible reminders of something much larger. The real shock was discovering that an enemy could choose discipline over revenge, law over hatred, and humanity over cruelty. Even in the middle of history's most destructive war. Perhaps that is why these memories have endured for more than 80 years. Not because they tell us that war is kind. War never is. But because they remind us that even in times defined by violence, the choices people make still matter. A bottle of soda can become a symbol. A scoop of ice cream can become a lifelong memory. And a single act of unexpected decency can outlive the guns, the tanks, and the battlefields that once seemed destined to define an entire generation. When those German prisoners first stepped off the train, they expected to meet only an enemy. Instead, many encountered something they had never been prepared for. And that unexpected encounter became one of the most remarkable and least remembered stories of the Second World War.